The persistent failure of the government to effectively address the needs of the South African youth, in particular the scourge of joblessness and lack of opportunity, has reached a critical juncture. It is fueling a growing sentiment among many young citizens that participating in the electoral process is an exercise in futility, devoid of any hope for bringing about meaningful change.
72% of respondents, to be clear, in the last Afrobarometer survey are saying they are dissatisfied with democracy and would forego the vote for the sake of improved economic well-being. So that shows us that we need to do a better job of demonstrating the correlation between democratic strengthening and economic growth that actually is broad-based. Now, that hasn't transpired here for a host of reasons, but the fact that it hasn't transpired isn't an argument against democracy or against the vote. It's an argument that we need to strengthen the relationship between democracy and good economic outcomes.
A stark illustration of this sentiment is evident in the statistics from South Africa's recent elections. In 2009, abstaining voters accounted for 40% of the eligible electorate, a figure that crept up to 43% in 2014 and surged to a concerning 51% in the 2019 elections. Of the 11.7 million eligible young adult citizens, only 5.6 million registered to vote in the same year. This worrying trajectory raises fundamental questions about the health of civic engagement and the future of representative democracy in the country.
Registering to vote shouldn't have to be hard. Better yet, you should be able to do it from wherever you are, and here is how. Step 1.
One suggested solution is to simplify the voter registration process. The state could automatically register eligible citizens, given it already has the identification details of all citizens. While this approach may reduce the gap between registered and unregistered voters, does a higher registration rate necessarily lead to increased voter turnout?
What we do see if we look at, for example, the municipal level in South Africa is that areas which have higher registration rates, which are most often urban areas, do also tend to have the highest voter turnout rates as well. However, one concerning gap in South Africa, which has become more apparent in recent years, is that the voters who are already registered are not turning up to vote on the day itself either. So both voter registration rates and voter turnout rates on the day themselves are declining at the same time.
In the South African context, where fewer than half of eligible individuals actively participate, it might be time to explore the implementation of a mandatory voting system.
Often what is happening now due to high levels of voter apathy is that politicians will then focus on the ones who will turn out to vote, and thereby ignore many of those who are not turning out to vote and many of those who have the most legitimate grievances in South Africa today. So there's a good chance that having some sort of mandatory voting will increase the linkage between accountability that exists between the citizen and the politician.
Mandatory system has merit indeed because it can facilitate maximum participation, which is good for democracy, and which also gives legitimacy to the government who would have emerged out of that election. But our country does not have the culture that supports it.
So on the surface, it seems as if mandatory voting is an attractive solution to the problem of voter dissatisfaction and low voter turnout. However, it's a little bit like dealing with inequality in an unpalatable way. Often governments, for instance, will say, right, the problem with inequality is that there are too many wealthy people and we've got to tax them, we've got to redistribute the cash. The problem is that it doesn't actually deal with the drivers of inequality. And in the same way, we need to deal with the drivers of democratic dissatisfaction. And that requires a lot more than simply imposing an obligation to vote.
What would probably work is for those of us in civil society to embark on a program that would show people how they can use their vote as a tool of power rather than a tool of of weakness. Apathy arises simply because people feel that whether I vote or don't vote, it means nothing. But if political power that comes from the people had a price tag to it, and then if political parties are not prepared to pay that price tag, which is accountability, fulfilling promises, then the shock treatment should be to politicians, where people use their vote to remove their loyalty from whatever political party that they have a problem with, so that they use that power to say, we can take it away from you. Then the shock becomes that of political parties rather than the citizenry.
From the outset of South African democracy, there's always been a debate about whether our MPs and our members of provincial legislatures should be directly accountable to the people in some way. Famously, President Mandela was also a big advocate of this sort of system. However, we haven't seen these sorts of institutional changes happen yet. There is a very good argument that if politicians are directly elected by voters themselves, they'll have to pay much more attention to voters, not only when it's election season, but also between elections, because now your future position is contingent on your ability to deliver for your citizens.